Hello everyone, welcome to From the Star Wars Home Video Library. I'm your host Nathan P. Butler, author of A Saga on Home Video, the 3-volume second edition of which can be found in paperback, hardback, or on Kindle as a print replica copy over on Amazon at this point. Might make a great sort of late Christmassy type thing, or a way to spend some Christmas cash if you like this stuff. And that is the last time I will plug it that way in this little run of episodes that I'm recording here. I apologize for my voice. It is very dry and my throat is very scratchy at this point. It's cold as hell outside here in the Atlanta area, as it is pretty much everywhere in the United States at this point. This is a special countdown episode of From the Star Wars Home Video Library, but instead of counting down things like the top packaging, the worst marketing decisions for a particular company, and other things we've covered here in some of these previous top whatever videos, this time we're going to be looking at something that is actually inspired by a question that was asked for one of those From the Star Wars Home Video Library Q&A episodes that I decided to expand into something a little bit broader here. In the comments for Q&A number 11, Jeff Kahn asked this question for number 12, which I have instead held for this ranking episode. What he asked was, "Hi Nathan, I have a very specific question, and it's one that will probably take you quite a while to figure out. How many copies of A New Hope do you own? I mean the total number you own, whether official, non-official, or homemade, such as taped off TV or burned off the web. No matter if they are on disc, tape, or film, or if they are domestic or foreign releases. Also, in how many different formats? If you could list the different formats that you have A New Hope on, that would be much appreciated. Thanks." So, when I was looking at this question, I initially thought I could easily answer the question of formats. There was no way in hell I was going to be able to actually count the number of copies of New Hope I had. That would take forever. Until I realized that really I wanted to do that kind of count for my collection when it came to the live action films at least anyway, and was finally reaching a point of being able to do that. You might recall that because the first edition of A Saga on Home Video had a checklist at the back of it, I had considered putting a checklist at the back of the second edition, but it would have been just too much. It would have added months of work, and the sheer amount of stuff that's actually in the book is absolutely massive, especially now that it has expanded into the second edition. So instead, I'm putting together an Excel file of all the stuff in my own collection that I will then somehow tweak and make available publicly online for fellow collectors to download and add their own stuff or remove the stuff they don't have or otherwise mark things for their own collection as well. I'm working on that at the moment. And I had just finished putting everything, if you watched the previous monthly update video, everything from the books, both the first edition and second edition, into the spreadsheet. There's more work to be done, but I got it all in there. But then that raised the issue of, okay, what about the stuff that wasn't in the book? What about Spaceballs? What about newer stuff like 52577 or those releases from 2022? What about those? I need to make sure there's not stuff in my collection sitting on a shelf that because it wasn't in the book, it didn't get on the spreadsheet. I need a way to catalog that. So what I did was what I often do. I took out my phone with the camera and just went step by step through my shelves to take pictures of everything in the collection. Everything in the closet here, in another room, the shelves that you can't see, these shelves that you can see, pictures of it all. And since most of this is multi-layer, it was like take a picture, move stuff, take a picture of the layer behind that, then put it back. Over and over again, taking, I think it was 234 total pictures of my collection to try to track everything, including some boxes of like duplicates and spares that I have sitting at the bottom of a closet just in case I ever need them. So I went through, did all that kind of stuff. And in doing so, I realized that as I had done that so that I could basically cross stuff off as I made sure it was on the spreadsheet or mark stuff I knew I needed to add to the spreadsheet, I also created a relatively easy way for me to actually count how many copies of each film I owned. Not just A New Hope, but each copy. However, if I'm going to count something from my own collection, I personally do not consider bootlegs, for the most part, or fan recreations to be part of a count that I would want of how many copies I own of a particular film, because those are essentially unofficial copies. And to put it mildly, it would mess up the data, I would say, in what I want to count for myself. So what I decided to do is sort of take this and tweak the format of the question just a little bit. One, I will not be counting anything relating to bootlegs or anything like that, or anything in relation to fan creations like the despecialized editions and whatnot. Only official releases of the films. However, because I was going to be doing this anyway, I decided to do it for all of the live action films, and a few of the other items that I can mention as kind of honorable mentions or whatever here at the beginning. So what we're going to take a look at here is we're going to do a rundown, like a countdown, right? Like a 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, etc., like a top whatever type thing, ranking the Star Wars films by the number of copies of the individual film that I actually own on some type of official release. I was kind of surprised by some of these numbers. I think the most interesting thing about this will probably be the numbers, not so much the order. The order, like you could probably guess what the top 3 are going to be that have the most copies in my collection, and probably guess which the last, couple might be. I will tell you, this will be a top 10, even though there are 11 live-action films. Why? Because strangely, 2 different films from 2 different eras of Star Wars films actually are tied with the exact same number of copies in my collection. I didn't expect that to happen. A couple of other ground rules before we start. I will be counting copies of the film, not releases including copies of the film. So, for example, say we want to look at the Japanese Rise of Skywalker Steelbook release, right? That had a 4K copy of the film, a Blu-ray copy of the film, and a Blu-ray 3D copy of the film. In my count, that is 3, not 1. It's one package, it is 3 actual copies of the film. The 2006 DVDs, 2004 cut, supposed unaltered edition, 2 copies for each release out of 2006, that sort of thing. I also am not counting partial or selected scenes releases, so no Super 8, no Star Wars Movie Viewer, no Mini Cinex, though I do have those counts to add in at the end if you're just curious how those would have panned out as part of these numbers. As to how I counted them, basically I just went through, I designated each picture from each shelf in some way, like this one here, let's say. That one there, it's 2 different layers, right? It's got some Force Awakens stuff in the front from South Korea and from China, and then behind it, other Force Awakens stuff. So this was the 3rd tower, top shelf out of 6, so that was 3-1. The first layer is picture A, take those off. The second layer is picture B. I took note of all those, and next to each one wrote down how many copies of each film fit for that particular picture, or in that particular picture, and did that for all of these, 6 shelves each, all of the black ones. There are 4 of those, 5 shelves each, but the 2 that you can't see on camera typically only have 2 to 3 shelves of stuff. Lots of pictures out of my closet, plus boxes of spares and stuff like that, plus a shot in the other room for that AFI set that just won't fit in here. All on here, which I then took, tallied, and tallied, and tallied, and tallied, and tallied, and in so doing came up with the final numbers of each. So let's dive in here. These Star Wars live-action films, as they exist on home media, ranked by how many copies I own from least to most. Let's see what kind of guesses you come up with as you're watching. Feel free to put them in the comments, but obviously there's no way for me to know if you commented while you were watching or after watching, so just if you want to do that for fun. But you might try to guess in your own mind as we go which order they'll be in, and how many copies of each. I will also give you a final tally of the total number of copies of all 11 at the end. So definitely a more self-indulgent version of a top whatever list, but I thought this might be a fun thing to do. For what it's worth, honorable mentions before we start here. Ewoks will not be included. The Ewok telemovies, they were telemovies in the United States, not theatrical. I do not include them, but as sort of an honorable mention thing, I currently own 14 copies of each. In the case of Battle for Endor, 2 of them are screeners. In the case of Caravan of Courage, 1 of them is a screener. And then, of course, there's also the Clone Wars film, which was theatrical, but not live action. And if you're curious, it's weird. With all the different copies of things from Clone Wars that I own, you would think I would own a ton of copies of this particular film, and it's a lot compared to most people. It was actually only 18. Only 18 copies of the Clone Wars film, despite there being so many different variations of it. So, Ewok telemovies, 14 each, and then Clone Wars film, 18. And that brings us into the actual list, starting again with number 10, because 2 will be tied at one of these numbers, and they'll both count as the same number. So, number 10, 10, 10. You would probably expect that realistically, as you go along with collecting Star Wars home video stuff, the stuff that's been around the longest would have the most copies. The stuff that's been around the least would have the least copies. That just tends to be the logic that would tend to play into something like this. So you would figure it would be the very last of the Star Wars films to be released, Rise of Skywalker, to wind up at number 10. And you would be wrong. Number 10 is actually not Rise of Skywalker, it's Solo. Solo, A Star Wars Story. And I believe this is primarily owing to the fact that Solo, A Star Wars Story got a lot of different versions released internationally and in the US with, the store exclusives and things like that, like the other Disney era films. But unlike Rise of Skywalker, it never appeared in any Skywalker Saga box sets. Skywalker Saga box sets kind of pad the numbers for something like Rise of Skywalker and the other 8 Skywalker Saga films. So number 10 is Solo, coming in with a grand total of 51 copies in my collection. Yes, 51 copies of a single Star Wars film is the least in my collection when it comes to the live-action theatrical films. The numbers are only going to get bigger from here. Then at number 9, it's Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. Unfortunately, all that padding, from the Skywalker Saga box sets only gets Rise of Skywalker so far as the newest film, coming in my collection with a grand total of 55 separate copies of that film. That is, separate discs or whatever of the film. And actually, I guess that is a film like the Disney era. It's all discs, right? It's not any of them are going to be on actual cassettes of any kind. So Solo is number 10, Rise of Skywalker is number 9, which brings us to number 8. It's going to jump up in terms of the number of copies, but not by a ton here. And I do find it an interesting one, given the nature of one of its compatriots in the same trilogy. My number 8, coming in at 72 copies, is Attack of the Clones. Attack of the Clones just didn't get the sheer number of other variations, at least not that I have picked up, of the other prequels. It's the lowest prequel on this list. 72 copies is still not, it's not a rational number. It's still pretty damn huge. But when it comes to the prequels, it is interesting that Attack of the Clones winds up at the bottom in terms of number of copies, again with 72. I was not expecting that. I figured it would have been, first Revenge, then Attack, then Phantom Menace. I figured. Nope, not when I did the actual counting here. My guess is that Revenge of the Sith is somewhat padded by the fact that I have purposely sought out things like VCDs and other VHS releases from other regions, as the US didn't have one, perhaps. And I know Phantom Menace was one that I wanted to have those comparison pictures in the book, so I purposely sought out VHS copies from a lot of different regions for that one. So I'm not surprised at how Phantom Menace is above Attack of the Clones. I am a little bit surprised maybe about Attack of the Clones versus Revenge of the Sith, but we'll see where Revenge falls in a little while. That brings us to number 7, which numbers 8, 7, and 6 are really close together. Super close together. My number 7 coming in at 73 copies, just one more copy than for Attack of the Clones, is actually my favorite of the films. It's Rogue One, A Star Wars Story. That's a lot of copies of that film, and I think part of that is bolstered by the fact that thanks to Matt Fry donating his collection into mine, I have a lot of copies of that Target exclusive version that comes with the DVD version, the Blu-ray version, and the Blu-ray 3D version, and I've got at least, 6 copies of that at this point. So I think that certainly padded those numbers there when it comes to actually finding it within the collection and whatnot. It only really takes up a cube and some space and some spare boxes at this point. Then coming in at number 6 with 74 copies. So notice it was 72, then 73, then 74. I said these were really, really tightly bound together. We have the one that I thought would beat out Attack of the Clones, but didn't, which is Revenge of the Sith, here at number 6. The 6th live-action film to be released winds at number 6 on the list here, as we are rounding out the first half. Again, 74 copies of Revenge of the Sith in my collection, and that's without there being a US VHS release at all. But I found VHS releases from elsewhere, VCD releases, and so on. And that was right around the era when you started to see more of the exclusive releases from different stores like Best Buy and Target and so on. So it kind of makes sense that it'd be a little bit further down the line, perhaps. But they still didn't have nearly as many store exclusives as some of the later films did. So maybe not a surprise that it's not further up on the list, perhaps. Which brings us to the second half of the list, right? With number 5, and this is actually where we have our tie. Number 5 is a tie of 2 different Star Wars films that both in my collection amount to 88 copies of each film. The first of these 2, and they really can be discussed in any order because again they are exactly tied at 88 copies, is The Force Awakens, the first film of the Disney era. Interestingly, the one that it is tied with, also at 88 copies, is the first of the prequel era, The Phantom Menace. The The Phantom Menace and The Force Awakens, both sort of restarting the surge of Star Wars films in their eras, in theaters, actually wind up with the exact same number of copies. I find that a little bit odd. And that obviously the libraries are very diverse for those, or divergent for those. Phantom Menace had VHS. It had Laserdisc, at least in Japan. It had VCD, for instance. And yet, The Force Awakens, well, it had 3D releases and so on that were different. But it's primarily a Blu-ray kind of thing. Blu-ray and DVD kind of thing here. So, yeah, whether you want to consider Phantom Menace or Force Awakens, the one that's on top or bottom, they're basically side by side there because they're tied at 88 copies at number 5. I found that kind of surprising to me. The fact that there's, with the sheer number of copies in my collection of any of these, the fact that there's a tie between any of them, especially if they're not from the same trilogy, kind of surprised me in general. But for it to be those two was particularly surprising to me. So now, given that we've already talked about both of the anthology films, and we've talked about 2 of the sequel trilogy films, and we talked about all 3 prequel films, that only leaves 4 left. So you can probably guess what the number 4 has to be. Because surely there's no way that this one would have more than the 3 ones that obviously are going to have more because they've been around for much, much, much longer. Unsurprising here, probably, number 4 for me is The Last Jedi, with a grand total of 90 copies. Just 2 more copies than The Phantom Menace and The Force Awakens here. 90 copies of The Last Jedi in the collection. And had it not been for the fact that I have a second copy of that premium limited box edition, or whatever they're calling it, out of Japan to replace the one that I had that's just a little bit damaged on the inside, it would have been right beneath The Force Awakens and Phantom Menace there. Or perhaps tied with it. I forget exactly how many copies of the film there are. I think it's 3 in each of those. So it would have been just behind Phantom Menace and Force Awakens, but for the fact that, yes, I'm counting those spare copies in this as well, as long as they are legit copies. And by spares, you know, we're talking about things also like I have the steelbooks of the original 6 films up on my shelf opened. I have sealed steelbooks with the J-cards and everything still on them sitting in the closet. I have a couple of spare copies of the Video Rental Library VHS sitting in the closet. One that is legit but is missing the sticker. And so on, like legit complete and legit missing the sticker. So, yeah, the fact that duplicates are included as long as they are still part of my collection and they're still legitimate copies does tip the scale there. Which brings us to the ones that everybody knew were gonna be the top 3, which is the original trilogy. They've been around forever, right? It is, as of now, the 40th anniversary of the home video launch of A New Hope. That was in 1982. It is 2022. They sure didn't celebrate it worth a damn. Didn't have releases in the US. They just had those few releases in places other than the US. But 40 years of home video releases means we should be talking a ton for A New Hope, but also very shortly thereafter from Empire and Jedi as well, with lots of trilogy sets and individual releases. There should be some big numbers here, and unsurprisingly, we're seeing numbers starting out here that are almost double where we ended up last time. Number 3 is The Empire Strikes Back, with a grand total of 166 copies in my collection. That is not including, mind you, the 3 Super 8 reels, because those are selected scenes. If we included Super 8 reels, we'd be at 169 rather than 166, but it still wouldn't beat out number 2. It'd be one shy of tying. Number 2, again, probably a given at this point because of what number 1 must be, is going to be Return of the Jedi. And Return of the Jedi, in my collection, I have 170 copies of Episode 6. So, very, very close there with Empire. My guess in terms of what nudged Return of the Jedi ahead of The Empire Strikes Back on this one is probably things like how, even though usually they were released in parallel, so it was, you know, equal releases coming out for each, you did have the CED era where there were a couple of different versions for Jedi and only one for Empire, where Jedi had the blue or the white caddies. Could also be looking back at stuff like how the original, or one of the early Laserdisc releases for Jedi, I guess it was the original one, there was like the white or the silver version of the logo kind of stuff. There's a little bit more variation when it comes to a Jedi, I suppose, that were out there. So that winds up with just barely more in my collection there. And then to answer the question from Jeff Kahn, without counting in bootlegs and fan restorations, which I know does kind of cheat the question just a little bit, we come to A New Hope. How many copies do you believe I have in my collection at this point as of Christmas Day? I'm recording this the evening of Christmas Day. We finished our family stuff earlier. As of Christmas Day 2022, as of the 20th anniversary of the launch of my first Star Wars fan audio drama, Second Strike, which is Christmas Day 2002. As of this day, what do you think? You've heard how many I have of the others. What about A New Hope? The answer is, with A New Hope here at number 1, 204 copies of that film in my collection. And no, that doesn't include any of the Super 8 stuff, the movie viewer stuff, or the mini Cinex stuff, because they're all selected scenes. If you include those as well, that is 16 more copies, bringing the total number of copies of A New Hope to 220. Boy, that's a lot of freaking copies of A New Hope. I didn't realize it had gotten that high. I didn't realize most of these had gotten anywhere near that high, but with releases having multiple copies in them and things like that, especially in recent years, it's a very fast-growing collection as you pick up stuff. You know, imagine all the different copies just from that stuff from 2022 that entered into the collection here. Now, before we go on to like a total for this stuff, adding it all together for those 11 films, I do want to address the other part of Jeff's question, which is what formats I have A New Hope on. For these official releases, I have A New Hope on VHS, Beta, Video 2000, also known as VCC or V2000, Video 8, CED, VHD, Laserdisc, VCD, DVD, Blu-ray, and 4K Ultra HD Blu-ray, as my voice is starting to give here. The formats that I do have Star Wars stuff on that I don't have A New Hope on are ones that it was never released on in any official capacity. U-matic, mini DVD, PVD, UMD, and Blu-ray 3D. As for the actual totals, I was kind of hoping it would wind up being 1138 because that'd be very fitting. It turns out I guess I need to get 7 more copies because if you add up my copies of all 11 live-action Star Wars films, not counting selected scenes from Super 8, Mini Cinex, or Movie Viewer, it is 1,131. 1,131. If we do count in the Mini Cinex, Movie Viewer, and Super 8, we're talking 1,150. That is a lot of copies of the films. And that's not even counting stuff like, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 27 copies of The Making of Star Wars, 15 of SPFX The Empire Strikes Back, 7 of Classic Creatures, 11 of From Star Wars to Jedi, The Making of a Saga, I don't know here, 5 of The Legacy Revealed, one of which I showed in a recent episode, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. Lots of different copies. That's the thing about being a Star Wars home video collector. You'll wind up with many different copies of the same productions. What typically is the difference is perhaps the bonus features, or it's the resolution or format that it's on, or oftentimes it's just a packaging variant or a bonus content variant where it's a physical bonus item like the Micro Machines little C-3PO head thing from 1997. That's sort of the nature of collecting. If you're into this sort of thing, that's where a Saga on Home Video 2nd Edition comes in. That's why I created it, as a guide to all this stuff. And of course, to feature it here on the show as well. And pretty soon, once I finally do get a chance to finish putting together that spreadsheet, and you can see why it's freaking enormous and taking so long, I will have that available for others to check out their own collections as well. So to recap this, but do it in episode order in some form, that was 88 copies of The Phantom Menace, 72 copies of Attack of the Clones, 74 copies of Revenge of the Sith, 204 copies of A New Hope, 166 copies of The Empire Strikes Back, 170 copies of Return of the Jedi, 88 copies of The Force Awakens, 73 copies of Rogue One, followed by 90 copies of The Last Jedi, 51 copies of Solo, and 55 copies of The Rise of Skywalker, making up 1,131 copies of the Star Wars films. Not in that many products, because many have multiple copies of the same film, for instance, multiple discs of different formats of film in a single package, but that is the current snapshot alongside those 14 each for the Ewok films and 18 for Clone Wars. Holy crap, that's a lot. No wonder my office is pretty much full at this point. But thank you very much to Jeff Kahn for that question. I hope this sort of satisfied your curiosity. I apologize for just not including that other stuff, but to me, that would have thrown off these counts, and I want to keep these counts and use them to build off of in the future as I collect more, so that I can more easily tell how many copies are in my collection as we go on. But with that, we will wrap up this top 10 or whatever you want to call this. I hope you found that interesting for those who have followed this show for a while. And if it makes you think that I'm just a little bit crazy in terms of the sheer amount of Star Wars home video stuff I've managed to collect, much of it in the process of writing the book, mind you, then I'm not entirely sure I'm inclined to disagree with you about that one, because, yikes, 204 copies of A New Hope? Good golly. With that, we'll wrap up this episode. Thank you for watching, and may the Force be with the home video viewers. No matter how many copies you own, hopefully a more manageable and rational amount than perhaps I do.